across the layered reaches of mapped space where councils convened, beneath vaulted light and ancient accords were whispered like prayers, there existed a rule older than the first jump gate. It's a rule that no archive could trace to an author, yet every species obeyed it because history itself had taught the lesson, and the rule was simple: never enrage the humans and in an age. When empires rose through ceremony and fell through pride, the rule endured because humans were not the strongest, nor the largest, nor the most numerous, yet they were the most stubborn and the most adaptive and the most relentless when pressed. And so, when the concord of many gathered to settle trade paths and borders, they placed human envoys at the center, not out of respect but caution, and when new species joined, they were briefed with gentle language and stark examples, and nods of understanding followed, and for a long era the rule held until a coalition of ambitious polities driven by hunger for advantage convinced themselves that the rule was myth dressed as warning, and that humanity had grown soft within prosperity and law, and that careful pressure could bend them without consequence. And so the first pressure came as tariffs layered upon routes that fed human colonies, then came inspections that lingered, then came seizures framed as audits. And when humans protested, the coalition smiled and offered committees, and when humans appealed, the coalition delayed, and when humans withdrew from talks, the coalition advanced proxies to occupy neutral relays, and through it all humans responded with restraint because they preferred patience to spectacle, and preferred prayer to escalation, and observers mistook restraint for weakness. While scribes recorded calm statements and traders noted reroutes, and farmers on distant worlds adjusted schedules, and engineers quietly modified designs, and teachers reframed lessons, and children learned stories about rivers that carve stone, not by force, but by persistence. And still the coalition pressed, convinced that momentum had become destiny, and so they crossed the line, not with a strike, but with a theft as subtle as it was profound, when they appropriated a network of medical beacons that humans had seeded across frontier space to prevent plagues and to answer distress, regardless of flag in the coalition. Claimed authority and charged fees and denied access to rivals and justified it with clauses and footnotes, and at that moment the rule cracked, and every species felt it like a pressure change before a storm, because humans did not shout nor threaten nor mobilize fleets and parades. Instead, they went quiet, and silence from humans was the sound that archives described as dangerous because silence meant coordination, and coordination meant intent, and intent meant follow-through. And in the weeks that followed, nothing obvious occurred yet. Everything changed as human ships rerouted through obscure lanes, not to evade, but to map, and as human researchers published open models that optimized supply chains for resilience, and as human artists released works that reframed identity around stewardship, and as human negotiators resigned from councils and returned with smiles that did not reach their eyes, and as human communities voted with rare unanimity to activate compacts that had slumbered as contingency in the coalition, congratulated itself on profits rising and leverage consolidating, and then the consequences arrived not as a blow, but as an unraveling. Because markets that depended on human logistics discovered delays that compounded into scarcity, and insurers cascaded risks based on newly transparent data, and premiums spiked. And financiers froze credit, and the coalition blamed cycles and promised adjustments. While human cooperatives offered alternative routes freely to all who respected access, and soon neutral worlds defected to the open network, and the coalition lost tolls and tried to enforce control, only to find that the network they had seized no longer mattered because a superior lattice had blossomed beside it, built on redundancy and trust. And when the coalition attempted to sabotage the new lattice, they found every node mirrored, and every failure anticipated, and every attempt documented and shared, and the lesson deepened as human legal teams filed claims across jurisdictions, not to punish, but to establish precedent, and as human educators trained mediators who traveled to worlds destabilized by the coalition policies and helped them stabilize without taking sides, and as human engineers released designs for clean power that undercut the coalition energy cartel, and as human historians curated exhibits that traced how shared infrastructure built peace, and how monopolies built resentment, and the coalition attempted propaganda, but discovered that human narratives were not slogans but stories that people recognized as true because they reflected lived experience, and trust shifted like a tide, and ships changed registries, and captains chose routes that aligned with reliability and safety, and the coalition realized too late that power had moved without a single shot because humans had converted outrage into construction, and grief into systems, and patience into leverage, and when coalition leaders finally requested talks, humans agreed and arrived with thin folders and clear voices, and a proposal that restored the beacons to neutral stewardship and dissolved predatory fees and compensated harmed worlds through a fund. It's administered transparently, and the coalition balked and threatened sanctions, and humans nodded and accepted because they had already planned for that path, and the sanctions hurt the coalition more than anyone else because alternatives existed and dependencies had been mapped and diversified, and over time, the coalition fractured as members defected, seeking stability, and the rule became visible again, written not on stone but in outcomes, and the archives updated their entries to note that enraging humans did not always look like fire and steel, but often looked like a mirror held steady until those who stared into it saw themselves and changed or fell away. And generations later, when a new species asked why the rule mattered, elders told them a story of a time when some believed rules were myths and myths could be ignored, and how humans responded by building a future that made the violation irrelevant and left only the lesson that restraint is a choice, not a weakness, and that when pushed beyond it, humans will outbuild, outthink, and outlast anyone who mistakes their calm for consent.